Hi, so this is Ben Dunham, and today I'll be talking about my capstone project on bank lending in the U.S. So bank lending is a critical driver of the economy. It's one that the Federal Reserve Bank of the U.S. constantly measures. So my specific question was, what factors influence the lending levels of banks across the U.S.? And specifically, this is a measure of what investment is going on in the economy, and this is pretty critical. The literature was narrowed down to these three papers, specifically, which gave me the definitions of my variables, and essentially their conclusion was that there's really two areas. There's economic variables that affect lending, and there's also bank-specific variables that affect lending, with the economic variables being more significant. So I also did divide my variables into the same two conditions. You have loans outstanding as the target. That is measured between January 2000 and June 2018 monthly. Then the Federal funds rate, the GDP, inflation rate, will be the economic variables, whereas bank deposits, bank capital, total assets, number of banks, bank equity, total assets will be the bank-specific conditions. Real estate prices was removed because there was too many missing variables. I think it was more than 20% of the data was missing. And that brings me to my next point, where missing data was probably the largest challenge I had with this data set. Most of the variables were measured monthly, so that was the parameter I used. However, many others were measured in quarterly terms. So to overcome that, I ended up using just the quarterly data for each specific month, and just use that to eliminate any of the missing variables and essentially treat it as an average. The skewness, if you look at Fed funds rate and inflation, were slightly skewed. However, that's inherent to the data, as the inflation rate is targeted at 2%, and the Fed funds has been under 2% for the last 10 years. So looking at the data specifically, this is loans outstanding over the last 18 years, and you'll see there's a trend upwards that then at the recession, or in between 2007 and 9, starts to trend downwards, and it kind of stays that way for the last few years. So that drove me to divide the data into two sets: prior to the recession and then the data after the recession, and that's how we kind of moved into modeling the data. And then you'll see preliminarily how GDP and the Fed funds, so those economic variables, are significant factors, as well as banks and Fed funds. So then moving into modeling the data, I tested several models. However, the best by far was the DMINE regression for both data sets. I used the average squared error due to the interval nature of this data, and we're looking to estimate a number of bank, the number of amount of loans outstanding. And so the pre-recession had relatively high average squared error for statistical purposes. Same with post-recession, but as seen compared to the other models, this was by far the best. Moving to the specifics on each model, when the pre-recession, we see that there's really only 3 variables chosen for this model, and the p-values on only GDP and commercial banks were the most significant. In the post-recession, we have the same 3 variables: commercial banks, GDP, bank deposits. However, we see inflation rate and Fed funds rate become more significant here. And so this is the pre-recession data. We see that as there are more loans outstanding when there is less banks, and then the opposite for bank deposits and GDP. A higher GDP is more loans, and more deposits equals more loans outstanding. However, when we go to the post-recession data, it's the complete opposite. Going back, if you look, there's a complete reversal on all 3 variables, which is quite interesting to see. And I think what that indicates to us is that in the pre-recession, the banks were looking less so at specific variables. There was more so just an environment to lend. So really, these 3 variables just represent the supply of loans available and a growing economy. Whereas we go to the post-recession, it's quite opposite, and banks at this point begin to consider other variables. As we saw, they can begin to look at the Fed funds and inflation rate, which significantly changed after after the recession. And as you can see this year, there's a tremendous drop of the Federal Reserve rate, and even though that's a means to ignite lending and investment, we see that loans actually decreased in this period. And so what some of the literature pointed to, and what some of these results indicate, is that prior to the recession, banks were not specifically looking at variables. After the recession, there was a mentality shift. Banks became more aware of the risk that was involved. Kind of the aftermath of the recession kind of took a toll. So not specifically these variables, however, more variables that can't specifically be measured. And also, I also looked at the overall period, so all 18 years, and how that affected it, and that added those bank-specific variables like capital ratios and equity ratios. So if you think about it as a whole, during these 18 years, kind of the economic conditions might offset each other to allow the more bank-specific conditions to influence lending. But yeah, so moving on, further analysis might indicate that a longer period of time might be necessary to investigate, to see truly how specific these loans are affected by various variables. I think in this period between the recession was truly the most significant variable affecting how lending or the amount of lending that occurred in these 18 years. I think the recession had a major impact on the mentality of banks and how they were lending, that ultimately affected more so than truly the bank or economic conditions that were occurring. But yeah, that sums up my analysis, and hope you enjoy. Thanks.